Back in 1990, a young girl from Oregon disappeared mysteriously, leaving her parents with no explanation for more than 20 years. But after 22 long years, her father opened one of her old yearbooks, and what he saw changed the course of everything. A thick fog drifted off the Pacific, creeping into the quiet seaside town of Mornington, Oregon, wrapping it in its usual early morning veil. Frank Sanders stood silently at the window of the room that had once belonged to his daughter, watching the dense mist dance around the distant lighthouse. The picturesque charm of the town, with its towering forests and rugged oceanfront cliffs, used to bring him peace. But since the day his daughter disappeared 22 years earlier, that beauty had taken on a haunting stillness. Frank turned away from the window, his eyes roaming over the untouched room. Every detail remained just as Alicia had left it on that spring day in 1990, shortly after finishing high school. Her posters still clung to the walls. Her desk was arranged neatly with books and notes. Her closet was full of clothes that had gone unworn for over 2 decades. "It's time," he murmured to himself, recalling the talk he'd had with his wife Elaine the night before. They had finally come to the painful decision, after 22 years of waiting and hoping, they needed to accept that Alicia wasn't coming back. This would be the day they would begin sorting through her belongings, donating what could help needy children and placing the rest in the attic for safekeeping. Pushing the window open to let in some air, Frank stirred up thick layers of dust that had settled undisturbed for years. He sneezed and rubbed at his watering eyes, then walked over to the closet and began to remove her clothes. Every garment brought back a flood of memories: the soft blue sweater she loved, the dress she'd worn to junior prom, the worn jeans she had decorated with her own patches. He worked carefully, dividing the items into boxes, one to give away, one to store, and another for sentimental keepsakes. When he reached her school materials, he paused. These were more than just supplies. They symbolized her goals, her future that never came to be. She'd been accepted to the University of Oregon, planning to pursue marine biology. As Frank sifted through the schoolwork, a book caught his eye. Something unfamiliar: Alicia's high school yearbook. Oddly enough, he realized he had never opened it before. In those dark days following her disappearance, neither he nor Elaine could bring themselves to look at her face in those pages. Smiling and full of hope, surrounded by classmates who had all gone on with their lives. Frank sat down on her bed, the book heavy in his hands, as though he was holding a part of her life that he'd never touched before. He turned its glossy pages, finally stopping at Alicia's senior portrait. Her beaming smile struck him with a fresh wave of sorrow. 22 years, he whispered, gently tracing her face in the photo with his finger. "I need to remember you without the pain, sweetheart." His gaze drifted over to the image next to hers, her best friend, Amy Davidson. Seeing Amy's face triggered memories of sleepovers, shared meals, whispered conversations and laughter floating down the hall. Frank realized, with some surprise, that he hadn't heard from Amy in a long time. After Alicia vanished, Amy used to stop by regularly. Then, gradually, the visits stopped. Intrigued, Frank began flipping through the section of senior profiles. Each student had a dedicated page with a short blurb and chosen quotes. He found Alicia's entry and read her youthful words. "Thanks to Mum and Dad for always believing in me, to all my teachers who pushed me to grow, and to my best friend Amy. Don't forget to return my book, The Secret Garden. Illustrated edition. You old grandma, love you forever." Frank chuckled softly, a sound caught between fondness and sorrow. That playful jab at Amy was just like Alicia. He turned the page to find Amy's profile, which spoke of ambition, pursuing passions, and standing up for oneself. His thoughts returned to the book Alicia had mentioned. The Secret Garden had always been her favorite. She had collected multiple versions of it throughout her childhood. But had Amy ever given it back? He couldn't recall seeing it among Alicia's belongings. Moved by curiosity, Frank began rummaging through the boxes of her books. With the dust bothering his nose and eyes, he decided to bring the boxes to the living room, where he could breathe more easily. There, he carefully unpacked everything, placing stacks of books and magazines on the coffee table and floor. There were stories of fantasy, science textbooks, nature periodicals, but no illustrated version of The Secret Garden. That's when a possibility hit him. Maybe Amy had kept it all these years. On impulse, Frank flipped to the back of the yearbook where students had scribbled their phone numbers and notes. He found Amy's handwriting, "Call me anytime, BFF." Without high expectations, Frank picked up his phone and punched in the old number, assuming it wouldn't work anymore. Sure enough, he was met with an automated message saying the number was out of service. Just as he set the phone down, the front door creaked open. Elaine entered, arms full with grocery bags from the farmer's market. She stopped in her tracks, shocked to find books and magazines scattered throughout the living room. "Frank, what is all this?" Her voice was laced with surprise, and something deeper, something raw and painful. "I was just going through Alicia's things, like we talked about," Frank said, rising to his feet. Elaine's expression hardened. "We said we'd pack things up and put them away, not turn the house upside down. I thought we were finally trying to move on, not sink back into the past." "I'm not stuck in the past, Elaine. I found her yearbook. I was looking for something," he replied. "What could be so important?" she asked, depositing the grocery bags onto the kitchen counter, her posture rigid from emotion. Frank held out the yearbook, pointing to Alicia's light-hearted message about the forgotten book. She mentioned Amy still had it. The illustrated Secret Garden. I wanted to see if it was in her stuff. Elaine let out a long, frustrated breath. "A book, Frank? Does it really even matter anymore? Alicia's books have just been sitting here collecting dust for years. There's no need to bring Amy into this. She probably doesn't even remember it." "Do you know where Amy is these days?" Frank asked, subtly shifting the focus of the conversation. "Yeah," Elaine said, turning away as she began unpacking her grocery bags. "I run into her once in a while when I'm out in town. These days, she's living in a camper." "I was thinking I might go see her," Frank said hesitantly, "not just because of the book, but it's been such a long time. She used to be like part of the family." Elaine stopped what she was doing and turned to face him, her expression steady and serious. "Frank, not today. I have nothing against Amy, but I'm not ready for that right now. Last night, we agreed it was time to clear the room and finally move on. Seeing Amy today, it just feels like going backward." She gestured to the disarray of books and memories spread across the living room. "I'll stay and take care of cleaning all this up. I'll start packing everything for the attic, just like we planned. If you still want to go, that's your decision." Frank gave a slight nod, understanding her hesitation. After all, his idea had been completely on impulse. "I'll go by myself," he said quietly. Elaine gave him directions to the spot where Amy typically parked her camper, but added a caution. "Please, don't press her too much, Frank. Alicia disappearing like she did. It had to affect Amy really deeply. They were closer than sisters." Frank gathered a few essentials, the yearbook, his phone, wallet, and car keys. As he headed toward the front door, he cast one last glance at Elaine, who had already begun methodically returning Alicia's books to storage boxes. He felt a slight flicker of guilt leaving her alone with the task, but something was urging him forward, drawing him toward Amy and possibly toward answers he hadn't fully defined. The door clicked shut behind him as he stepped out into the cool grey fog of Mornington's coastal air, clutching the yearbook tightly to his chest. Driving along the winding roads that curved with the coastline, Frank followed the route Elaine had described. His destination lay about 20 minutes outside the center of town, an unassuming camper park nestled near a wooded area. Several mobile homes and campers were parked there, overlooking the trees. The area was quiet and rustic. Frank parked and scanned the site, looking for any sign that identified where Amy lived. Around a dozen different campers were spaced around the lot, some with outdoor seating, others with potted plants and personal touches that made them look more permanent. He walked up to a man cleaning the windows of his RV. "Excuse me," Frank said politely, "I'm trying to find Amy Davidson. Do you happen to know which camper is hers?" The man nodded and gestured toward a blue and white camper parked at the far end of the lot. "That's her place. Nice lady. Keeps mostly to herself." Frank thanked him and made his way across the gravel. The camper was modest but clearly looked after. A small plant sat cheerily by the door. He inhaled and knocked lightly. After a few seconds, the door opened to reveal a woman in her early 40s. Her once blonde hair now held hints of grey, and faint lines marked her matured face. She looked at him with puzzled politeness, not recognizing him. "Can I help you?" she asked, with a slight furrow of her brow. Frank suddenly realized that over 2 decades had changed both of them. Back then, she had been a teenager, and he had been 22 years younger. "Amy, it's Frank Sanders, Alicia's dad," he said carefully. Her eyes grew wide in surprise. An emotional wave crossed her face, blending recognition with sadness and something softer. "Mr. Sanders, wow, please come in," she said warmly, stepping aside and holding the door open. Frank climbed the 2 small steps and entered. The interior was compact, tidy, and full of personality, with framed photos, houseplants, and colorful cushions making the small space feel lived in and homey. "Have a seat. Would you like a cup of coffee?" Amy offered, motioning toward the small table tucked into the corner of the living area. "Coffee would be great, thank you," Frank replied, sliding onto the bench. As Amy moved through the small kitchen to prepare it, Frank noticed the way she moved slowly, almost cautiously, as though processing his presence in real time. "What brings you here after all this time?" she asked, placing a hot mug in front of him before taking a seat across the table. Frank reached over and laid the yearbook on the table. "I found this today while we were finally starting to go through Alicia's things. I realized I had never actually opened it before." Amy's gaze locked onto the yearbook cover. "I remember this," she said softly, extending her hand to brush her fingers over the surface. Frank flipped it open and turned to the page where Alicia had written a note in her profile. He pointed to the message. "Alicia wrote this, something about a book you borrowed. I was just curious if you ever gave it back." Amy's expression warmed, tinged with sadness. "No, I didn't," she admitted. "I was really forgetful back then, and Alicia knew it. She used to tease me about it all the time." She stood, walked over to a lower cabinet beneath her bed, and pulled it open. After searching briefly, she emerged with a well-worn copy of The Secret Garden, the illustrated edition. The colors had faded slightly, and its corners showed the wear of time. "I kept forgetting to return it," she said softly, holding the book with reverence. "And after she went missing, I just couldn't let it go. It's the only piece of her I have left." She cradled the book like it was fragile crystal. "Would it be okay if I kept it? It's really special to me now." Frank gave her a gentle nod. "Yes, of course. You should keep it." He took the book for a moment, carefully opening it. The pages had yellowed with age, but the illustrations were still beautiful and vivid. As he flipped through it, a loose paper slipped out. A makeshift bookmark. It was a torn piece of a youth fashion magazine. Unfolding it, Frank discovered it was a page from a teen editorial. A photo shoot featuring teenage models. One photo caught his eye, a boy in trendy clothes posing confidently. Something about his face felt strangely familiar. "Do you know who this is?" he asked, pointing to the photo. Amy leaned over to get a closer look. "That's Jason Murray. He went to school with us. We were in the same grade." Frank glanced back down at the yearbook and turned to Jason's profile, which sat just a few pages away from Alicia's. "That's right. I remember now," Frank said thoughtfully. "He was already doing modeling back then. Pretty talented kid." "I've heard he still does the occasional modeling gig," Amy commented. "He even has his own clothing brand now." Frank looked up with interest. "You know, Elaine once said something about you and Jason dating back then. I didn't really think much of it at the time." Amy's demeanor shifted at once. "That's completely false. I was never in a relationship with Jason. Actually, I never had feelings for him at all. He and I weren't close, but he did spend some time with Alicia." Frank's eyebrows rose in disbelief. "Alicia? Neither she nor Elaine ever said a word to me about Jason." "It happened during our 11th grade year," Amy clarified. "That was about 12 months before we graduated. Jason was into Alicia for a short period, but it was nothing serious and it didn't last long. Once she and I realized he had a questionable character, we both kept our distance. After that, Alicia never brought him up again." Amy paused for a second, her eyes narrowing slightly as if recalling something forgotten. Actually, come to think of it, I did catch them chatting a few times during our senior year. Their interactions seemed somewhat close, which threw me off, since we'd already agreed he wasn't trustworthy. Alicia even started asking unusual things about him. Frank leaned forward, intrigued. What kind of things? She wanted to know if I thought someone like Jason could change with support, if maybe he wasn't as bad as people made him out to be. She even convinced me to drive by his place once, just to see where he lived. I thought it was odd at the time, but she always had this big, compassionate heart. She genuinely believed everyone had some goodness deep down. Frank asked with a tense expression, "Did the authorities ever learn about this when they investigated her disappearance?" "Yeah, I told them everything," Amy confirmed. "They questioned everyone from our class, including Jason. But by that point, Alicia had already started dating Brandon Knox. The police focused more on him than anyone else at the time." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "I remember Brandon. He came by our house a few times to pick Alicia up. Elaine and I always had our doubts about him, but as far as I recall, he had a solid excuse for his whereabouts when Alicia went missing." "You're right," Amy said. "If I remember correctly, he left Mornington not long after. I think the investigation put too much pressure on him." Frank's mind was buzzing with scattered pieces, trying to fit them together. "And Jason? Do you know what came of him?" Amy shrugged gently. "I don't recall there ever being anything concrete between them. Just Alicia asking those few strange questions. She didn't seem especially interested, at least not outwardly." Frank looked again at the torn magazine page featuring Jason's photo, that makeshift bookmark Alicia had used. Something about it didn't sit right with him. The fact that Alicia had been privately interacting with Jason without ever mentioning it to him or Elaine gave him pause. He voiced the thought to Amy. She replied with a faint, nostalgic smile. "That came from one of Alicia's favorite teen magazines. I couldn't stand Jason, and because of that, she ripped out the page he was on. She folded it up and joked that the best use for it was as a bookmark." Frank reflected on that for a moment, then glanced back at her. "Do you happen to know where Jason is now?" Amy reached for her phone and began scrolling through some group chats. "Actually," she said, "our old high school alumni group just had a get-together last weekend at Jason's place. I didn't go, but someone shared his address in the chat thread." She offered her phone to Frank, showing him the message. "Would you mind sending it to me?" Frank asked, pulling out his own phone. After exchanging numbers, Amy forwarded the address to him. "Do you think Jason might have something to do with what happened?" she asked gently, uncertainly voicing the fear. Frank hesitated. "I can't say for sure, but I think the police need to know about the connection between him and Alicia, as minor as it may seem. The fact that Elaine and I didn't know about it, it's enough to raise questions. When Alicia started seeing Brandon, everything was out in the open. We knew." He stood, preparing to leave. "Thank you, Amy, for being honest with me. And for the time." Before he reached the door, Amy lightly touched his arm. "Please tell Elaine I say hello, and thank you for letting me keep the book. It really means more to me than I can express." Frank gave her a small but sincere nod. With the yearbook under his arm, he stepped outside into the fading daylight, his thoughts spinning with a growing list of unanswered questions about Alicia's past and her vanishing. Back in his car, Frank sat quietly for a moment, the yearbook resting on the passenger side. New information swirled in his mind, especially the revelation that Alicia had had any kind of connection to Jason Murray. What unsettled him wasn't the connection itself, but the fact that he and Elaine had never known about it. Reaching for his phone, Frank dialed the number of Detective Ron Keller, the officer who had overseen Alicia's case back when it all happened. Though retired now, Frank knew he still lived nearby. Unsurprisingly, the call went straight to voicemail. It was, after all, a Sunday afternoon. Staring down at his phone, then shifting his look to the message Amy had sent with Jason's address, Frank hesitated. He had promised Elaine they would begin to close this painful chapter today. But something Amy had said, and more specifically, that handmade bookmark, refused to let go of his thoughts. Alicia had been unusually curious about Jason, asking hypothetical questions, even going out of her way to see his house. "Just a quick drive," Frank murmured, almost to himself. just to know where it is. Roughly 20 minutes later, Frank's car rolled into one of Mornington's more upscale neighborhoods, areas he'd rarely visited before. The homes here were large, nestled along quiet streets, each with lawn care that seemed professionally maintained. It felt like another world compared to the modest house where he and Elaine raised their daughter. Pulling up to the address from the alumni thread, Frank spotted a huge two-story home with trimmed bushes, a circular driveway, and a sprawling front yard. It stood out among the neighboring houses, clearly showing the heights of Jason's success since his school days. Frank parked his car across the street, keeping a respectful distance. He stayed in the driver's seat, simply watching. The front gate was open. A moment later, the front door opened, and Frank saw someone step outside. A man tall and well-groomed, accompanied by a young woman. Even from where he sat, Frank could recognize the features of the boy he'd just been looking at in the yearbook. Jason Murray, now in his early 40s, still bore the good looks and poise of his youth. There was a confidence there, something shaped, no doubt, by years of personal and professional achievement. Frank watched as Jason walked the woman to her car, kissed her on the cheek gently, and waved as she pulled away. As Jason turned to head back inside, his glance wandered across the street and landed squarely on Frank's parked vehicle. Too late, Frank remembered that his car's windows weren't tinted. He was clearly visible from the outside. Jason's demeanor shifted instantly. His posture stiffened, alert and wary. Deciding there was no sense in pretending otherwise, Frank shut off the engine, stepped out of his vehicle, and made his way toward the front gate. "Good afternoon," he called out, aiming for a light, conversational tone. "You're Jason Murray, right?" Jason didn't return the greeting. Instead, his eyes narrowed as he demanded sharply, "Who are you, and why are you watching my house? Are you a member of the press, some kind of journalist?" "I'm sorry," Frank replied, stopping a few feet from the gate to maintain respectful distance. "I truly don't mean to bother you. My name's Frank Sanders. I'm the father of Alicia Sanders. She was in your graduating class. She vanished 22 years ago." Jason's expression changed abruptly. His eyes darkened and his body seemed to tense further. "What do you want from me?" he asked flatly, his tone devoid of warmth. Frank was taken aback by the frostiness in Jason's voice. "I heard your class reunion was held here just recently," he said. "I'm only trying to piece together whatever fragments I can about my daughter's life. I was told you two may have been close at one time." Jason's reaction was instant and sharp. "Who said that?" "Amy," he sneered. "She didn't even show up to the reunion." Frank kept his voice even. "I'm not here to accuse anyone or make trouble. I'm simply looking for clarity. It's been over 2 decades, and we still have no answers about what happened to Alicia." "Why are you even asking me?" Jason responded, clearly on the defensive. "I wasn't her boyfriend. There was nothing romantic between us. I hardly knew her, and I definitely wasn't into her. I said as much to the cops years ago. I don't see why I should have to answer these questions again." Frank blinked, unsettled by the vehemence in Jason's reply. "I didn't say you two were involved," he countered. "I only heard you might have had a short-lived friendship." Jason cut him off. "If she and I ever spoke in school, it was probably just because I needed a quick loan or some help with class assignments. That's it, and I always paid her back, by the way. We never fought. I told the police everything during the investigation." Although his voice was calm on the surface, Frank picked up on the increasingly tight movements in Jason's body. He was shifting his stance restlessly, glancing around as if watching to see who might be looking. Jason continued, his voice hardening further. "I don't understand why you're showing up here now. I've worked hard to build something. I have a reputation to protect. I can't have reporters or nosy strangers snooping around, making up stories." Before Frank could get another word in, Jason turned his back and started walking toward the front door. "You should go," he said over his shoulder. "There's nothing else I can tell you about Alicia Sanders." Frank stood in place for a moment, stunned by the sudden end to the conversation. Jason's reaction had been far too intense for such basic questions. Why would someone who had supposedly only known Alicia casually be this rattled decades later? As Jason disappeared inside his upscale home, Frank slowly made his way back toward his car. When he placed his hands on the steering wheel, he noticed they were slightly trembling. Embarrassment and regret flooded over him. He hadn't meant to provoke anyone or stir up drama, especially after promising Elaine that they'd finally begin to move on. "What was I thinking?" he muttered under his breath. "I told Elaine today would be different, that we'd finally put this behind us, not dig it back up." He turned the ignition and took one final look at Jason's house before driving away. He dreaded how Elaine would react once she realized where he'd gone instead of helping her sort through Alicia's things at home. She'd be disappointed, and rightfully so. Frank had once again let himself be consumed by the same unresolved questions that had haunted them in the early days after Alicia's disappearance. As he made his way back toward Mornington, he tried to rationalize Jason's behavior. Maybe the man had just been annoyed at having his Sunday disturbed. Perhaps it had nothing to do with guilt. Anyone might react with irritation if approached out of the blue about something from so long ago. Still, Jason's response hadn't just been annoyed, it had felt nervous, edgy, almost like fear. Was it just the surprise of being confronted unexpectedly, or was there something deeper beneath his defensiveness? Frank shook his head as if to clear it. He needed to refocus. He had spoken with Elaine just last night and assured her they would finally move forward with their lives, not get drawn back into the past. He had to let this go. But as he approached town, Frank couldn't stop replaying the encounter at Jason's home. The man's hostility, his strange behavior, it kept gnawing at him. Frank had come for answers, and now he had even more questions. Without consciously deciding to do so, Frank found himself steering the car toward the Mornington Memorial Funeral Home. If he and Elaine were serious about closing this chapter, perhaps it was finally time to begin planning a formal memorial service for Alicia, even if they'd never recovered her remains. When he entered the funeral home, the room was peaceful. A kind-eyed receptionist listened to his inquiry, then handed him a selection of brochures outlining various services and pricing options. Frank thanked her before heading back outside, a stack of pamphlets tucked under his arm. But just as he reached his car and touched the handle, something caught his eye across the street. A sudden flicker of movement. It was Jason Murray. Frank froze as he saw Jason step out of a local hardware store. Moments later, Jason exited the store holding two items, a long-handled shovel and a small wooden box. Frank's breath caught in his throat. He instinctively crouched slightly and got into his own car, watching from behind the windshield. Jason placed the shovel and the box in the back seat of his car. Then, as if nothing were out of the ordinary, he walked next door into a flower shop. Through his rearview mirror, Frank watched the scene unfold, heart thudding. Minutes later, Jason came back out carrying a bouquet of fresh white hyacinths. White hyacinths, Alicia's favorite flower. A shiver slid down Frank's spine. Of course, it could have been nothing. Lots of people liked white hyacinths. Maybe it was all a coincidence, but between Jason's nervous behavior, the defensive tone, the shovel, and now these exact flowers, something felt very wrong. Frank's chest tightened as he watched Jason drive off. Without pausing to think through the consequences, Frank started his car and began to follow from a safe distance. He stayed just far enough back not to be seen, but close enough not to lose him. Jason drove through town calmly, then took a turn onto the coastal road, heading straight toward the cliffs of Whitlow. It was a scenic route, known for its sweeping ocean views and secluded vacation cottages tucked among the trees on its slopes. Frank kept a cautious distance, careful not to draw attention to himself. In time, Jason turned onto a secluded driveway that led to a modest cottage perched near the cliff's edge. Frank drove by casually and then pulled over farther up the road, where dense trees offered concealment. From there, he observed Jason unlock the cottage door and step inside. Moments later, Jason reappeared, carrying a gallon jug of water. He placed it in a small garden cart, along with a shovel, a wooden chest, and a bouquet of white hyacinths. Without hesitation, Jason started down a narrow footpath leading toward the edge of the cliffs. Frank exited his vehicle and crept quietly through the undergrowth, descending the slope while remaining hidden within the thick foliage. An increasing urgency pushed him onward. Frank waited until Jason had gained significant distance before trailing him once again. The path meandered through low pines and flowering bushes, eventually opening to a remote lookout with a stunning view of the Pacific Ocean. The late afternoon sun hung low, casting elongated shadows over the rugged terrain. Concealed behind a cluster of large rocks, Frank watched as Jason chose a spot close to the cliff's rim. Jason scanned the area warily, confirming he was alone, then began to dig. The soil was stony and resistant, suggesting it had not been disturbed in a long time. After digging about 2 feet deep, Jason laid the shovel aside and knelt beside the hole. He opened the wooden box and gazed at its contents in silence. From Frank's hidden position, he couldn't see inside the box, but Jason's expression appeared solemn, almost reverent. His lips moved as though he were reading or silently recalling memories. Jason carefully sifted through a collection of papers, examining each one with deliberate attention. Eventually, he closed the box, but before securing the lid, a strong gust of wind swept across the cliff, scattering several pages. Jason swore under his breath, slammed the lid shut, and scrambled to retrieve the papers that had blown away. Once he had recovered them, he placed the wooden box into the hole. He gently set the bouquet of white hyacinths on top, then began to refill the grave. With focused care, he patted down the soil and poured water over it to pack it more firmly. When finished, Jason stood in silence over the newly covered ground. Then, in a voice just loud enough to rise above the crashing surf, he said, "I think you can carry these memories now, Alicia." The name struck Frank like a punch to the chest. He recoiled instinctively, losing his footing on some loose stones. He caught himself against a nearby tree, clamping his mouth shut to suppress any sound. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He was certain Jason could hear it. Jason's head snapped up. He scanned the brush around him. "Hello?" he called sharply, voice edged with suspicion. "Is someone out there?" Frank froze completely, barely daring to breathe. Jason gripped the shovel and stepped cautiously toward the trees where Frank lay hidden. He paused to listen, then took another step closer. Frank pressed tightly against the tree, willing the shadows to keep him concealed. After what felt like a lifetime, Jason stopped. "Just the wind," he muttered, though the doubt in his voice lingered. He cast one final glance around the clearing before gathering his gear. Instead of returning the way he'd come, Jason slowly circled the perimeter of the area, checking to make sure no one had been watching. At last, seemingly satisfied, he returned to the cottage, cart and empty water container in tow. He leaned the shovel against the cottage wall, got into his car and drove off. Frank waited, counting slowly to 100 to be sure Jason wouldn't return. When everything remained still, he crept out from his hiding spot. His legs trembled, but determination kept him upright as he made his way toward the freshly packed soil. He had to know what the box held. He needed to understand why Jason had spoken his daughter's name at what seemed to be a burial site. Frank retrieved the shovel Jason had left behind and headed back to the burial spot. He began to dig, his movements hurried but careful. The soil was damp, making it easier to move. In just a few minutes, he uncovered the hyacinths, their fragrance drifting through the air as he gently set them aside. As Frank's shovel hit the wooden box, a voice behind him chilled his blood. "I knew someone was there. I was right." Spinning around, Frank saw Jason only a few yards away, fury and vindication written across his face. "You shouldn't have returned," Jason said, walking forward with slow, menacing steps. "I spotted your car up the hill and circled back through the woods. What are you doing?" Frank tightened his grip on the shovel, holding it as both a digging tool and a possible means of defense. "I heard you say my daughter's name," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "What did you bury here? What does Alicia have to do with any of this?" Jason's expression twisted. "You don't understand anything. You don't belong here." Refusing to back down, Frank turned toward the half-dug hole, determined to uncover the truth. "I'm going to find out what's in that box." "Stop," Jason shouted, pulling a firearm from his coat. "Put the shovel down." Frank immediately raised his hands, and Jason lunged, attempting to wrest the shovel from his grasp. With his free hand, Frank quickly pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police," he warned. "They need to see what's here. Go ahead, shoot me if you want. At least I'll be with my daughter again, but I'm one tap away from alerting them." Jason, moving with surprising speed, knocked the phone from Frank's hand. It slid perilously close to the edge of the cliff. "Don't!" Frank yelled. He sprang forward, kicking the firearm from Jason's grip and sending it flying over the cliff's edge. Then he threw himself toward the phone, catching it just in time before it could slide over the precipice. With no hesitation, he tapped the SOS feature, knowing it would notify emergency services and share his exact location. "Please, Jason," Frank begged, slowly retreating from the increasingly erratic man. "The authorities are on their way. Just be honest with me. Alicia is gone. Nothing can bring her back. Keeping secrets won't help anyone." "You don't get it," Jason screamed, his face burning with emotion. "I still have everything ahead of me. My future, my company, my name. I can't let this destroy it all." "Did you kill my daughter?" Frank asked bluntly, his voice cracking with emotion. "If you truly cared for her, how could you harm her? She was my only child." Jason's face twisted. "I never fully understood how I felt about her," he admitted through gritted teeth. "She should have looked after herself better. She should have kept her distance, and if you truly loved her, you would have protected her more." "What are you trying to say?" Frank gasped, horrified. "You didn't really know her, not like I did," Jason said rapidly, his speech quickening. His grip on the shovel tightened, fingers turning pale. "You never saw the way she looked at me. She kept coming back, again and again." "Then why stay silent when she vanished?" Frank shouted. "Why bury everything out here like you're creating a grave?" "She turned on me in the end," Jason snarled, eyes wild with an emotion Frank couldn't name. Without warning, he surged forward, swinging the shovel and knocking Frank off balance before seizing him by the throat. Frank, older and physically weaker, couldn't free himself. He gasped as Jason's hands closed tighter around his neck. Bright spots flashed before his eyes. Then, cutting through the tense silence, the distant wail of sirens rose into the air. Jason's grip weakened as he looked up, startled. Several police vehicles roared up the private road, their sirens blaring over the quiet coastline. Frank sucked in air as Jason's hold loosened. Within seconds, law enforcement officers had surrounded them, weapons raised. "Release him and step back with your hands visible," one officer barked. Jason let go of Frank and slowly lifted his arms. The shovel clattered to the ground. Two officers quickly approached, restraining Jason and fastening handcuffs around his wrists as they recited his legal rights. Frank collapsed to the dirt, coughing and rubbing his neck. "Sir, are you okay?" a female officer asked, helping him to stand. "I think so," Frank rasped. "Thank you." As the police led Jason toward a patrol car, Frank pointed at the disturbed patch of soil. "Over there. He buried something there. He mentioned my daughter's name, Alicia Sanders. She vanished 22 years ago." The officer's face grew serious. "Sanders? I remember that case. Let me call Detective Ramirez." While some officers secured the area, a plainclothes detective approached and handed Frank his phone. "Mr. Sanders, I'm Detective Ramirez. Can you walk me through what happened?" Frank recounted the entire chain of events, discovering the yearbook, speaking with Amy, the unsettling meeting with Jason at his home, and then tailing him to the cliffs. "I know I shouldn't have followed him," Frank admitted. "But when I saw him buying a shovel and white hyacinths, Alicia's favorite flowers, something didn't feel right." Ramirez nodded. "You said he buried something." Frank pointed at the mound. "A wooden box under the flowers. Before that, the wind blew some papers out of the box, and he picked them up. He said Alicia could carry those memories now." Ramirez motioned toward the forensic unit that had arrived. "Let's find out what's here." Frank watched with rising tension as the forensic technicians began carefully digging. The first thing they revealed was the bouquet of white hyacinths, still vibrant and unspoiled. Beneath that, they uncovered a wooden container. The lead technician carefully opened the box and displayed its contents for Ramirez to examine. Inside was a collection of documents, handwritten notes, photographs, and printed text messages, their paper slightly discolored by time. Nestled among them was a small handmade wool doll, the type often made in children's art projects. "He just buried these," Frank said, "but he told Alicia she could have them now. That means he's kept them in his house all this time." Detective Ramirez donned gloves and began to review the contents of the box. The first items were printed text conversations between Jason and Alicia, dating back to when they were in high school. As Ramirez scanned the messages, her expression darkened. "Mr. Sanders," she said gently, "these messages suggest Jason and Alicia were involved in a secret relationship during their school years. It appears complicated." Frank stepped closer to get a better look. The texts revealed a relationship neither Frank nor his wife Elaine had ever known about. One conversation detailed a time they had gone out with friends, where Jason specifically asked Alicia not to invite Amy. During that outing, Jason had kissed Alicia without her consent. At first, Alicia was upset, but over time, the messages showed a shift. She seemed emotionally drawn to Jason despite her concerns, convinced he needed someone who cared about him. In multiple messages, Alicia expressed belief in Jason's potential to become a better man. But Jason's replies were manipulative. He leaned on her affection without ever offering commitment. This continued for nearly a year, Ramirez observed as she flipped through additional messages. Eventually, Alicia tried to end the relationship. The later texts reflected her growing frustration with the unhealthy dynamic. When she finally broke things off and began dating Brandon Knox publicly, Jason's responses turned frantic, then aggressive. Among the photos inside the box were several that made Frank recoil in revulsion. They were graphic images of Alicia, appearing to be restrained in each, her surroundings showing a rustic interior identical to the nearby cottage Jason had recently left, as well as locations recognizable from the adjacent forest. Detective Ramirez quickly turned the photographs over to shield them, but still examined the backs. Each one had handwritten notes, presumably in Jason's handwriting, scrawled across them. One picture was completely filled with a single sentence, written over and over. "You must still love me. You must still love me. You must still love me." Another had a short message. "Had a great time at the cliffs with you. Yours, Jay." But the most disturbing image showed Alicia's terrified expression. On the back, Jason had written a chaotic message, confessing that he was falling apart, that people were searching for her and referring to her with a slur, saying she wouldn't talk to him anymore. The message ended with a chilling apology, explaining that he had to kill her so that they wouldn't find her and arrest him. He added that she would remain in his heart forever, even if no one ever knew what they had together. "We'll need to interrogate Jason further to determine how exactly he ended her life," Ramirez murmured to a fellow officer. "He doesn't spell it out clearly in these notes." As more of the contents were reviewed, another search team that had been sweeping the surrounding area approached with urgency. "Detective, we discovered something," one officer said gravely. "Roughly 15 feet from here, there's a patch of soil that looks different from the rest. We did a shallow dig and uncovered bone fragments." Frank's legs gave out and he collapsed to his knees. After more than 2 decades of unanswered questions and shattered hopes, the painful truth was at last beginning to come to light. The forensic team widened the excavation, meticulously unearthing the area the officer had indicated. As the afternoon dragged on, more and more of Alicia's skeletal remains were revealed. Detective Ramirez walked over to Frank, who had been silently observing from a distance. "Mr. Sanders, would you like us to contact your wife? She needs to be informed." Frank gave a slow, numb nod. "Yes, and please reach out to Amy Davidson too. She was Alicia's closest friend. She has a right to know." While they waited for Elaine and Amy to arrive, Ramirez gently suggested Frank could go back to the station, but he declined. "No, I need to be here," he said with quiet resolve. "They should see this, all of it, before anything is touched. We've waited 22 years for this moment. I have to see it through." Elaine arrived an hour later, pale and shaken. She rushed to Frank, and they held each other tightly as Detective Ramirez carefully explained the discovery. Shortly after, Amy arrived as well, her face blotchy with tears shed during the drive. The three of them stood shoulder to shoulder at the perimeter of the dig site, grief binding them together as the full horror of Alicia's fate was slowly unearthed. Elaine turned to the detective, her voice trembling but firm. "We want her remains removed from here. She deserves to be laid to rest somewhere peaceful, not in the place he left her." "We'll make arrangements for that as soon as the forensic work is complete," Ramirez assured her. It should only take a day or two. Amy stepped toward the spot where bones were now visible, silent tears running down her cheeks. Her voice was raw as she whispered, "Why didn't you say anything, Alicia? We were best friends. I could have helped. We used to laugh about girls who fell for guys like Jason. I just don't get it." As the sun lowered behind the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the cliffs and sea, Frank, Elaine, and Amy stood watch over what had been recovered of Alicia. After so many years filled with longing, dread, and unanswered prayers, she had finally been found. "She's coming home," Frank whispered, holding Elaine's hand tightly. "She's finally coming home." 1 week later, a gentle procession of boats gathered off the coast of Mornington, just beneath Whitlow Cliff. The weather was unusually bright for that part of the Oregon coast, with sunlight glinting off the calm waters of the Pacific. Leading the group was a boat carrying Frank and Elaine Sanders, Amy Davidson, Detective Ramirez, and Detective Ron Keller, who had come out of retirement to show his support after following Alicia's case for decades. Trailing behind them were boats filled with former classmates, teachers, and the principal from Mornington High. Word of Jason Murray's arrest and the long-awaited discovery of Alicia's remains had quickly spread through the town, reigniting old grief in a community that had never truly healed since her disappearance 22 years earlier. Frank stood at the bow, gently holding a small urn. After deep consideration, he and Elaine had chosen not to bury Alicia in a cemetery. Instead, they had decided to release her ashes into the ocean, liberating her spirit from the place where she had been hidden for so long. "Today, we gather to say our final goodbye to Alicia Sanders," the minister began solemnly. "For 22 years, her loved ones have borne the weight of her absence, the pain of not knowing. Today, we release that pain and return Alicia to the sea, where she will never again be bound." Elaine stepped up beside Frank, placing her hand on his arm. "Alicia loved the ocean," she said, her voice carrying over the waves. "She was studying to become a marine biologist. She would have been happy knowing she'll now become part of the ocean she loved so much." Frank carefully opened the urn. Together, he and Elaine scattered Alicia's ashes over the water. From every boat, people tossed white hyacinths, letting them float on the waves and form a drifting tribute of flowers. Amy stepped forward next, tears spilling freely, and gently placed a worn paperback copy of The Secret Garden onto the water. "Goodbye, my friend," she whispered. "I'm sorry I never gave your book back." As the boats made their slow return to shore following the ceremony, Detective Ramirez quietly approached Frank and Elaine Sanders with an update on the case. "Jason has confessed," she told them in a soft voice. "He's given a full account of what happened. According to his statement, Jason had held Alicia captive in the remote cottage for several days after abducting her. He admitted to being obsessed with her, unable to accept that their brief relationship had ended and that she had moved on with Brandon Knox." Ramirez continued, "He told her they could make their relationship official, if only she would break things off with Brandon and tell everyone she'd taken a solo trip to celebrate graduation. But Alicia refused. She told him that after years of trying to love him and hoping he might change, she had come to realize he was damaged beyond repair." Ramirez's tone was calm, but the content was harrowing. Jason said her words cut him deeply. When she tried to escape, they fought near the cliff. According to him, Alicia nearly succeeded in pushing him over the edge. In a fit of rage, he overpowered her and struck her repeatedly with rocks. When he realized she was dead, he panicked and buried her body rather than call for help. Amy wiped fresh tears from her cheeks. "I remember when Alicia started asking me about Jason," she said quietly. "She wondered if he could change. I never understood why she was so curious about someone she always said she disliked. I had no idea they were secretly involved." She turned to Frank and Elaine, voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. If I'd known, maybe I could have done something, warned her, protected her." "This isn't your fault, Amy," Elaine said firmly. "Jason was manipulative and dangerous. Alicia wanted to help him, and he took advantage of that kindness." Ron Keller, the retired detective who had worked the case for years, shook his head with sorrow. "Since Alicia never openly dated Jason and he had no prior record, we never suspected him. We focused on others. Brandon mostly, since he was the known boyfriend at the time. He sighed. Jason must have just gone on with his life. No one looked in his direction again. As the boats reached the docks, Frank looked back at the waves. The white hyacinth still floated gently on the surface, bobbing in the ocean light. After 22 years of searching, hoping, and heartbreak, the answers had finally come. The pain remained. It would always remain. But now it was accompanied by a sense of resolution, of peace. That evening, Frank and Elaine sat together on their back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Between them on the small table sat a framed photo of Alicia, not the posed senior portrait from the yearbook, but a candid shot of her laughing on the beach, her hair wild in the wind, her face radiant with joy. "I think we can start to move forward," Elaine said softly, reaching over to take Frank's hand. Not by forgetting her, but by remembering her for who she really was. So full of life, so compassionate. Frank gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "She reminded me of you," he said. "Always believing in people, always wanting to help." Elaine gave a faint, bittersweet smile. "And she had your stubborn streak. Once she decided someone was worth saving, she never gave up." They sat in a long, reflective silence. The grief between them had softened. Not a wedge keeping them apart, but a bond forged through shared loss and love. "She was so young," Frank said at last. "So innocent. And still, she believed love could change people." "That's not a bad thing to believe," Elaine replied. "The world needs more of that." Her mistake wasn't believing people can change. It was thinking she had to do it all on her own. Frank nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in his wife's words. "I just wish she had told us about Jason. Maybe we could have helped her see the danger." "We'll never know," Elaine said gently. "But I believe, wherever she is now, she knows how much we loved her, and that we never gave up looking for her." Night fell over Mornington, and stars began to emerge in the clear sky. Frank's thoughts drifted back to the day he had rediscovered that old yearbook. That single note about a borrowed book had opened a door to the past, one that led them to the truth they'd sought for over 2 decades. The mystery of Alicia's disappearance had been solved. But the deeper mystery, how to live with her absence, remained. And yet, for the first time in 22 years, Frank felt a deep, quiet peace. Alicia had been found. No longer lost, no longer hidden, she was now part of the ocean she had loved so dearly. Free. Frank and Elaine would go on living, they would remember her. And maybe, in time, they would begin to heal.